Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take a whole stack of sources, official records, notes, research, and, well, really dig in.
Yeah, we sift through it all to pull out the key insights for you, our listener.
Think of it as your shortcut to getting up to speed without getting buried in all the details.
And today, we're diving into what's been happening this past week in Congress. We've got material from various places, including the Congressional Record itself.
So, a direct look at the debates, the bills, the whole dynamic.
Exactly. It gives you a real snapshot of what they're prioritizing right now, the political mood.
And our mission, as always, is to walk you through this impartially. We'll highlight the main arguments, show you the different sides just as they are presented in the sources.
Absolutely. We're not picking sides here, just laying out what the sources say.
And these sources, they cover a lot. Some really passionate arguments were made.
Oh, definitely. It's quite a bit to unpack, but we'll break down the key moments and help you understand the different viewpoints.
Okay, let's jump in. First up, a big one. The HALT Fentanyl Act. That's S-331.
Right.
Sources say it's up in the House now, and debate's going to pick back up tomorrow, June 12th.
That's the plan, yes. And according to its supporters, the main idea behind S-331 is to permanently make fentanyl analogs, Schedule I substances.
Under the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA.
Correct. Analogs being, compounds similar to fentanyl.
And why do they think that's so important? What's the argument?
Well, they argue this permanent scheduling is, frankly, long overdue and really crucial for law enforcement.
Okay.
It'd give them sort of stronger tools against traffickers.
Yeah.
And act as a deterrent.
A deterrent, especially with the crisis hitting communities so hard.
Exactly. They talk about communities plagued by poisonings. Kids are dying, as one source put it. So saving lives is the bottom line for them.
I also saw something about helping research. That seems a bit counterintuitive for Schedule 1.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
Yeah.
But proponents argue it actually promotes research by supposedly improving the registration process for researchers working with Schedule I substances. There's a detail in the sources. Apparently, experts are only studying about, 30 analogs right now?
Wow.
Out of a potential pool of maybe 4,800. So streamlining research access is, another stated goal.
Okay, so that's the case for it. But the sources definitely showed strong opposition to. What's their take?
A very different take. Opponents are saying, look, yes, the fentanyl crisis is horrific, but this bill treats it only as a criminal justice issue.
And they think it needs more.
They insist it needs a much broader public health approach. They bring up data from SAMHSA.
The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration.
Right. Showing that in 2023, only maybe a quarter of the people who needed substance use treatment actually got it.
Just a quarter. And the impact of that gap.
Well, according to the sources, untreated folks are 8 times more likely to die from an overdose compared to people getting medication treatment.
8 times.
Yeah. And opponents also highlight that nearly half the federal prison population is in for drug offenses. They point to racial disparities there, too, and argue that just incarcerating people can actually make their underlying conditions worse, not better.
So the argument is that mandatory minimums, long sentences for possession, it just means more prison time without the treatment that's actually needed.
That's exactly it. Some sources quote opponents calling this bill, S-331, a distraction, basically.
A distraction from the real need for public health resources and treatment.
Right, from tackling that fundamental gap.
And speaking of public health resources, there were concerns raised about SAMHSA itself in the sources.
Yes, there was mention of a letter from over 30 organizations, mental health groups, substance use professionals like the American Psychiatric Association, National Council for Mental Well-Being.
What was their concern?
They're arguing strongly that SAMHSA needs to stay a standalone agency within HHS, not get folded into something else.
Why?
They cite its critical role, its specific focus, its partnerships, and they're also worried about proposed budget cuts.
Cuts to SAMHSA.
Yes, specifically mentioning potential cuts to harm reduction prevention programs, and a $29 million cut to opioid overdose prevention and surveillance funding.
So even within this one bill, you see this huge tension. Law enforcement versus public health, penalties versus treatment.
It really lays bare how complex this is. Though it's interesting, the sources do mention a bipartisan fentanyl prevention caucus exists.
Oh, okay.
Co-chaired by Representatives Issa and Dean. So that suggests, there is some common ground, some shared desire to do something about the crisis.
Even if they strongly disagree on how to do it, like with this specific bill.
Precisely. Big disagreements on the strategy.
Okay, let's switch gears. Another area with a lot of action this week, according to the sources, the District of Columbia. Legislation affecting D.C.
Yeah, quite a bit. H.R. 2056 came up that would require D.C. to follow federal immigration laws more closely.
Okay.
And H.R. 2096, which aims to repeal some D.C. laws about police discipline.
And wasn't there something about their local budget, too?
Yes, the District of Columbia Local Funds Act, that's been stalled, and there was discussion around that as well.
So what's the main argument from proponents for Congress stepping into D.C.'s local affairs like this?
Well, proponents emphasize Congress's unique constitutional power over D.C. because it's the nation's capital.
Right, the oversight role.
Exactly. They frame these bills as necessary federal oversight. Republicans, with the majority, basically state they're reacting to a perception that D.C. isn't safe or isn't supporting its police enough.
Did they give specific examples?
They did. Speakers brought up incidents like a representative getting mugged, a staffer being stabbed.
Wow.
Using those to argue D.C. needs to focus on safety, deal with homelessness, and make the city great again, to quote the source.
There's strong language there.
Very. And some sharp criticism aimed at Democrats, accusing them of defending, quote, illegal alien criminals, gangs, and cartels.
So how did opponents, including D.C.'s own delegate, push back against that?
They pushed back hard, arguing, first off, that D.C. is complying with federal immigration law already, and that immigration is fundamentally a federal job, not the city's.
Okay. And on the safety issue?
They countered with data showing violent crime actually hit a 30-year low in D.C. this past year, down 22%.
A 30-year low. That's quite different from the picture being painted.
It is. They also mentioned the D.C. police chief supports a community policing approach and argued H.R. 2096, the police discipline bill, would actually undermine the chief's ability to manage the force.
And the immigration bill, H.R. 2056, what was the specific objection there?
Opponents argued it would just throw out existing local laws and clear rules about cooperating with federal law enforcement and replace them with nothing, essentially.
Creating confusion.
Right, creating confusion.
Yeah.
And they also noted that the D.C. Council and the mayor were already looking at revising those local policies anyway.
Got it. And that brings us back to the D.C. budget issue, the Local Funds Act.
Yes. The sources noted a continuing resolution earlier in the year had, quote, sabotaged the local budget process.
Sabotaged.
That was the term used. President Trump was mentioned as having called for this Local Funds Act to be passed quickly. But opponents point out that House leadership had said they were too busy with the big reconciliation bill.
H.R. 1, sometimes called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in the sources.
That's the one. Too busy with that to deal with D.C.'s local budget. But now, opponents say, since they found time for these other D.C. bills...
The argument is there's no excuse left.
Exactly. No excuse left to delay passing the Local Funds Act, which, crucially, appropriates D.C.'s own locally raised money for FY 2025 based on their own budget.
Right. It's their money, not federal money.
Correct. With specific limits and emergency provisions as outlined in the source material.
Okay, speaking of reconciliation and budgets, that takes us nicely to another major item this week. H.R. 4, the rescissions package.
Right. That's now under consideration. After the House approved the rule for its debate, HRS 499. That was after a pretty close procedural vote.
And H.R. 4 is tied to that bigger reconciliation bill, H.R. 1.
Yes. The sources indicate H.R. 1 has already passed the House. Now it's over in the Senate.
So first, what exactly is a rescissions package?
Basically, it's a bill to cancel spending authority, money Congress already approved, but hasn't actually been spent yet, clawing it back.
Okay, and what's the argument for doing that with H.R. 4?
Proponents are framing it as cutting waste, putting, quote, discretionary waste through the congressional shredder.
Strong imagery.
Yeah. They say it delivers on a mandate to cut spending, both little chunks and big chunks.
Did they give examples of what they see as waste?
Oh, yes. Specific examples were highlighted. $158 million for a peacekeeping mission in Lebanon. $3 million for an Iraqi Sesame Street project.
Iraqi Sesame Street.
That was mentioned. $833,000 for services in Nepal. $500,000 for electric buses in Rwanda. Things like that. And they also targeted funding for public broadcasting. NPR and PBS, arguing taxpayers shouldn't subsidize what they called left-wing media. That was a proposed $1.1 billion cut to the CPB.
So the framing is fiscal responsibility, cutting debt, getting rid of unnecessary spending.
Precisely. They called the cuts structural, targeting things like, quote, woke UN handouts, failing peacekeeping, Biden's DEI and climate propaganda, saying it's about cutting dead weight to get the country's finances in shape.
All right, that's one side. But the sources presented the arguments against H.R. 4 in really stark terms.
Extremely stark. Opponents called it a scam, con job, and a grift.
Wow.
Arguing it wasn't about real savings. One speaker called the cuts stupid, preposterous, self-defeating DOGE cuts. Basically, politically motivated and harmful.
And harmful how? What were their examples?
They argued the cuts would be devastating, literally leading to deaths, especially hitting vulnerable people and U.S. allies abroad.
Specific programs mentioned.
Yes, global health was a huge focus. A $400 million cutout of $900 million in global health programs, specifically hitting PEPFAR.
The AIDS relief program started under George W. Bush.
That's the one. Credited with saving millions of lives, opponents claim that previous illegal holds on PEPFAR funding had already cost tens of thousands of lives.
So they see these cuts as incredibly dangerous. What else?
They talked about development aid, a $2.5 billion cut impacting things like schools, food, water projects, cuts to funding for Ukraine and other allies, and the cuts to public broadcasting, which they defended as a trusted news source, vital in rural areas, and crucial for emergency alerts.
And how did they respond to the debt reduction argument?
One speaker really tried to put it in perspective, called the $9.4 billion in rescissions a drop in the ocean, compared to the $3 trillion they claimed was added by Trump's big ugly bill. Again, likely H.R. 1.
And they showed a chart to illustrate that.
Yeah, showed a chart comparison, and accused Republicans of shielding tax breaks for big oil and billionaires while cutting programs that save lives.
There was some procedural stuff mentioned, too, around getting this bill through the House.
Right. The rule for debate, HRES 499, apparently also included technical changes. These were meant to protect the special procedural status, the privilege of the main reconciliation bill, H.R. 1, as it goes to the Senate.
So smoothing the path for the bigger bill.
That's how opponents saw it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A procedural maneuver. And there was frustration about amendments being blocked. Specifically mentioned was one from Representative Goldman to stop the cuts to public broadcasting, the CPB. That didn't get a vote.
Okay, let's move over to the Senate side. The sources highlighted action on S-1582, the Genius Act.
Yes, a significant step there. The Senate voted to invoke cloture on that bill.
Cloture, that's the vote to end debate, right?
Exactly. It limits further debate and sets up a final vote. The vote was 68-30.
68-30, so pretty strong bipartisan support to move forward.
Definitely indicates that.
And this bill is about stablecoins.
That's right. Legislation dealing with stablecoins, those cryptocurrencies pegged to something like the U.S. dollar.
What's the goal, according to proponents?
They say it's about creating a well-crafted U.S. regulatory framework for these digital assets. They actually called it the most significant digital assets legislation ever to pass the U.S. Senate.
High praise. What are the arguments for regulating them this way?
Proponents see it as a chance for the U.S. to maintain its financial leadership in this new digital era.
Okay.
They argue a solid U.S. framework will boost demand for U.S. treasuries, which helps our fiscal situation and cements the dollar's global status.
And they stress the bipartisan work behind it.
Yes, highlighted months of bipartisan work, mentioning Senators Hagerty, also Brooks, Gillibrand, Loomis, and Scott specifically. They frame it as supporting innovation, but with smart regulation.
Okay, now the arguments against this bill, as presented in the sources, they got into some really serious territory, allegations of potential corruption.
They certainly did. Opponents used very strong language, called it a dangerous Rubicon being crossed, creeping authoritarianism. Some even called it a distraction.
A distraction from what?
From other potentially unpopular legislation, maybe tax cuts or Medicaid cuts mentioned elsewhere. But the core criticism was that the bill sets up a weak set of rules loaded with loopholes.
And they compared it to
past deregulation, like in the derivatives market before the 2008 financial crash. Basically warning history could repeat itself.
And the corruption angle, the sources were quite detailed there.
Extremely detailed. Speakers directly linked the bill to what they termed open government corruption, specifically involving President Trump and his business interests.
What kind of links were alleged?
Okay, so they alleged a connection between a $2 billion investment from a UAE entity linked to an AI company called G42 into a Trump-branded stablecoin, USD1.
A Trump stablecoin.
Yes. And they claimed that after this investment, the U.S. approved a sensitive AI tech transfer deal involving Microsoft and that same UAE company, G42.
Implying a quid pro quo.
That was the implication drawn by the speakers. They also brought up allegations about People buying Trump meme coins, mentioning $148 million from 220 individuals potentially seeking influence. They cited an example of a freight company president buying $2 million worth, allegedly to influence freight policy.
And how does this connect back to the Genius Act itself, according to opponents?
They argue the Genius Act accelerates the corruption by potentially expanding the market for this USD1 stablecoin and raising the specter of President Trump if reelected, potentially regulating his own company and competitors through these rules.
Wow. Were amendments proposed to address that?
Yes, they mentioned an amendment by Senator Merkley aimed at addressing this conflict of interest concern, but said it was blocked.
Were there other worries raised about the bill?
Yes. Concerns that stablecoins might pull deposits away from local community banks. A Senator Hickenlooper amendment that was also mentioned is blocked. And national security worries. That stablecoins could make it easier for terrorist groups or cartels to move money illicitly. They cited data from Chainalysis on crypto crime.
And a key frustration seemed to be the blocking of these amendments.
Definitely. Critics were very vocal that despite promises of an open process, amendments trying to address these serious concerns were shut down.
So the fear is that without stronger rules, the bill could lead to scams, financial instability, security risks, potentially linked back to these ethical questions.
That's the core of the opposition's argument, yes. And it's worth noting, similar themes about alleged corruption came up in related debates about arms sales to the UAE and Qatar, though defenders of those sales focused on strategic alliances, not directly addressing the corruption claims in those specific source excerpts.
Okay, wow. That covers a lot of ground on the specific bills. Let's maybe zoom out a bit. What broader political dynamics do these sources really highlight from the week?
Well, first and foremost, the incredible partisan divide on anything related to fiscal policy. Just look at H.R. 4, the rescissions package. Republicans frame it entirely as cutting waste, fiscal responsibility. Democrats frame the exact same cuts as devastating blows to crucial programs for the vulnerable, all while protecting the rich. It's like two different realities.
We saw that kind of narrative clash with the D.C. bills too, didn't we, on crime and immigration?
Absolutely. You get these totally opposing pictures painted. One side says D.C. is unsafe, chaotic. The other cites falling crime stats. One side talks about illegal alien criminals. The other emphasizes immigrants' humanity and says immigration is a federal issue.
That exchange about the MS-13 member really highlighted that intensity.
It really did. And you see it in other areas too, like how those LA protests were described, peaceful versus riots. Just fundamentally different framing.
And that undercurrent of debate about executive influence, potential corruption, business interests, mixing with policy, that seems pretty significant.
It's definitely a major theme coming from critics in these sources. The detailed allegations linking President Trump's businesses, the stablecoin, hotels, golf courses, to specific foreign policy decisions or legislative pushes like the Genius Act are central points of contention.
Contrasted with defenses based on alliances or dismissing criticism as just politics.
Right. And finally, you see those differing priorities on spending laid bare by the examples each side uses.
Yeah, that was striking.
Republicans pointing to Iraqi Sesame Street or Rwandan electric buses as waste. Democrats pointing to PEPFAR saving lives or funding for clean water as essential investments. It really shows fundamentally different ideas about what government should be spending money on.
So stepping back even further, what kind of context and analysis can we pull from all this? How does it fit together?
Well, one thing is seeing the potential impact ripple across so many areas. These aren't just abstract debates.
Right.
The rescissions could hit global health, rural broadcasting. Fentanyl policy affects public health, justice system. D.C. bills impact city life, governance. Stablecoins touch finance, national security. Arms sales involve foreign relations, ethics concerns. It connects to real life.
And the sources also give us a peek behind the curtain at the process itself.
Exactly. Mentioning things like cloture votes, House rules, engrossment corrections, discharge petitions. These sound technical, but they're the levers of power.
How things get done or stopped.
Right. Understanding the how helps you understand the what, which priorities win, which voices get heard. Process really is power in Congress.
The sources also seem to draw a lot of historical parallels.
They did. Comparing today's debates on social programs to 90s welfare reform, the stablecoin talk evoking the run-up to 2008, a Reagan reference about tearing down walls, even going back to the Founding Fathers' worries about the king, it gives the current arguments some historical weight, or at least context.
And underlying all of this, as you said, are these deeply held, often opposing values.
Yeah. Common sense versus chaos. Stability versus instability. helping working families versus playing politics, public broadcasting, trustworthy or biased, opioids, crime or public health, DC, local control or federal oversight, foreign aid, waste or life-saving, innovation versus preventing corruption. These value clashes drive the intensity.
Okay, looking forward then. Based on the sources, what's next for these key pieces of legislation?
Well, the HLT Fentanyl Act debate is set to resume tomorrow in the House. The Genius Act on stablecoins is moving forward in the Senate after that cloture vote. H.R. 4, the rescissions package, cleared its House hurdle and moves on, while H.R. 1 is already in the Senate's court. And that call to pass the D.C. Local Funds Act is still out there.
And it feels safe to say the broader issues aren't going anywhere soon.
Oh, definitely not. That tension between public health and criminal justice approaches, federal versus local control in D.C., debates over spending, foreign aid, tech regulation, ethics concerns. These are ongoing battles. They'll keep shaping the agenda.
With potentially significant consequences down the line, as the sources warned.
Yes. The sources raise potential long-term impacts on everything from public health and the economy to international relations and even trust in democracy itself. It all depends on how these fights play out.
Well, this has certainly been a deep dive into a packed week in Congress, drawing directly from those source materials. It really underscores how complex and interconnected everything is.
And how differently lawmakers can view the very same issues. It's a lot to track.
So for you, our listener, what does this all mean? It really means staying informed is crucial. If you want to look deeper into any of these bills yourself, Congress.gov is your best starting point.
Yeah, you can search by bill number S331, HR 4, etc., or just use keywords like fentanyl, stablecoin, rescissions.
You can see the official text, track where a bill is in the process, check vote records.
Committee websites often have more details on hearings.
Right.
And C-SPAN provides live coverage if you really want to watch the debates unfold.
And of course, reaching out to your own representatives is always an option. Phone, email, mail, district offices. Sharing your informed view is part of how this works.
Absolutely. Just staying aware of the different arguments being made is key to navigating it all.
So, as you follow Congress, maybe think about this. These arguments we've discussed, they often come down to really fundamental ideas about government's role, who it should serve, what its priorities are. Given what we've covered today, what questions do you think are most important to ask? And how do you find the information you need to reach your own conclusions?
Definitely something to ponder as you engage with our political system.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for tuning in.